Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Breaking Bias Summit. And today I am honored and delighted to be with one of my teachers and advisors and mentors and friends, no other than Sharon Salzberg. So, Sharon, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Oh, well, thank you. It's wonderful to see you.
For those of you who don't know Sharon, Sharon is a meditation pioneer, world renowned teacher, and New York Times bestselling author. She is among the first to bring mindfulness and loving kindness meditation to mainstream American culture 50 years ago, inspiring generations of meditation teachers and wellness influencers. Sharon is the co founder of Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, where I've spent months, I would say, of my life in the last couple of decades. And she's the author of 13 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Real Happiness, now in its second edition. Sharon's podcast, The Meta Hour, has amassed 6 million downloads and features interviews with thought leaders from mindfulness movement and beyond. So, Sharon, welcome. No words can really encapsulate the wonderful work and all the things you've done in the world. Um, and one of the things I wanted to ask you is, why did you say yes to being here, and why is breaking bias important to you?
Well, you are important to me, and you have been for many years. And, when I wrote a book many years ago called Real Happiness at Work, which a lot of people might assume is about finance or something, I really wanted it to be very inclusive of people who work on what I would call the front lines of suffering. Activists, caregivers, people who are really dealing with seemingly intractable systems, trying to make a difference in people's lives. And you gave me one of the most beautiful testaments to that kind of work and bringing qualities like mindfulness into it. So uh, you've always been on my radar as a really special person doing great work.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And likewise, one of my first memories of you is this was probably over a decade ago. I did two back-to-back retreats at IMS. One was a week long on loving kindness, and which is followed by a weekend of forgiveness. Um, and I found the loving kindness practice to be quite joyful, um, but it prepared me to move into the weekend on forgiveness, which was really, really difficult. And I remember sitting with you on our one-on-one interviews and just saying how hard it was to forgive, but not forgive others, forgive myself. And that became my practice, moving forward.
Hmm.
Um, so, as we kind of live in this world right now where we're kind of seeing so much polarization, yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the role of these heart qualities, loving kindness and forgiveness at this time.
Well, I wrote another book called, I keep doing that. I have done that, in the past. Let's put it that way. Um, which was called Real Love. And it was pretty much based on one line in a movie. The movie was called Dan in Real Life. And one of the characters in the movie says, "Love is not a feeling, it's an ability. Love is
Mm,
not a feeling, it's an ability." And of course, it can be taken as a feeling, which is the conventional sense and something we might crave and long for. But I began thinking more and more about love as an ability because that line matched my experience in meditation practice, where I realized when I saw love as a particular feeling, first of all, it narrowed it too much. It gave it credence only when it was in a certain emotional bandwidth, very narrow. But it might be something other than that. It might be suddenly including somebody where I've excluded them in the past, or seeing more clearly, oh, it's like a level of understanding, commonality that might not have existed before. And I
mm,
realized that as long as love was like that particular feeling for me, it was like a commodity, which meant someone else could give it to me, someone else could take it away from me.
wow.
So I used to get this image of like the UPS person standing at my doorstep holding this package and looking down at the address and saying, "No, I don't think so," and going somewhere else. And then there'd be no love in my life and I'd be totally.
Yeah.
But if it was an ability, it's mine, it's within me. And other people certainly may ignite it or threaten it, but ultimately it is mine. And so if I understand love as a power, not a weakness, not something stupid, not something sentimental, not something that's going to make me give up a sense of right and wrong and fighting for what I think is right, but something about deeply knowing our lives are connected, that we have something to do with one another, then if it's an ability, I came to realize maybe it's also my responsibility.
Yeah.
And if that was the case in a miserable conversation, if
Yeah.
I wanted love to feature in there, maybe I had to be the one to bring it in. And in a world just seemingly, increasingly governed by hatred,
Yeah.
if I want to see love somehow and influence, maybe I have to be the one to try to manifest it in some way. And so that's really what I think about all the time.
It's so beautiful because, two of the quotes that really inspire me, I think they're both by Gandhi. It's like, be the change you want to see in the world and lead by example. And I think they both are kind of two sides of the same coin. And, as I was reflecting on our conversation today, I was thinking about, your own life journey and how you discovered Buddhism in college and went to India when I think you were 20 or 21, like
I was
very
18.
young,
Yeah, I was 18.
18, even younger, like a teenager. Um, and of course, you come from a background, a family where there was a lot of pain and suffering. And also at a time where there was a lot of turmoil, you know, politically, economically, I think right after the civil rights movement, the student protests against the Vietnam War were happening, the women's movement, the LGBTQ rights movement, like all of this stuff was the labor movement, like it was happening. And then, of course, um, in India as well, there were so many things happening in Myanmar um, around emergency. So could you like just walk us through like how this young person that you were, how she came to, understand the world around her and discover these jewels? And then also what prompted you to bring these jewels back to the West where you're from?
It's the miracle of my life. I mean, I think of it a lot and like, how in the world did I do that? I went to college when I was 16. I'm a product of the New York City public school system, which liked to have, at least in those days, have people skip grades.
Hmm.
So I went to college when I was 16. When I was a sophomore in college, I took an Asian philosophy course because there was a philosophy requirement. And in all honesty, as far as I can remember, I looked at that schedule and I thought, oh, that's a convenient course. It's on Tuesday. Let me do that one or
Yeah.
something like that. And the course completely changed my life. So I had a very traumatic childhood, as many people do, a lot of loss, a lot of confusion. And like for many people, my family was one where you just never spoke about these things.
Yeah.
It was never talked about. And so I didn't know what to do with all of those feelings inside of me. And I will also say I felt very different, very other, very marginalized from the world that was certainly the world portrayed in media, like the perfect family, where
Sure.
nothing ever goes wrong and no one's drinking, no one's paying, no one's dying. So I took this Asian philosophy course, and in the context of the course, there were two remarkable things. One was when they were talking about the Buddhist teaching and his emphasis on the fact that there is suffering in life, unlike for the people for whom that is a depressing concept.
Yeah.
For me, it was incredibly liberating because it felt like maybe for the first time in my life, somebody was saying, "You're not so weird. You're not so different. You, in fact, belong to the
Hmm.
larger picture of life." And
Hmm.
so that was an incredibly inclusive statement for me. And then in the context of that class, I heard that, I mean, I kind of vaguely knew, but I heard more deeply. There were practices, there were methods, there were techniques called meditation that if you undertook them, if you really practiced them, you could be a whole lot happier. So I was going to college in Buffalo, New York. I looked around Buffalo. I just didn't see it anywhere. This is 1969, 1970. And the university had an independent study program where if you created a project, you could go anywhere in the world and do a kind of cross-cultural study and then come back for
Mm.
your final year. So I created a project and I said, I want to go to India and learn how to meditate and study it. And they said, okay. So off I went. So that is really the miraculous part that I was very frightened. I was 18 years old when I left. I was 17 when I did the application, and I'd never even been to California before. It was like, how in the world did I think I'm going to go to India? And I did. Like it was
Yeah.
something like I couldn't stay on the margins. I couldn't stay on the surface. I had to know, like, how do you do this stuff? And off I went to India. So I wasn't really interested in the philosophy or in comparative religion or having a new identity. I wanted to know the real, how do you do it? And so
Yeah.
I finally found that. I started my first intensive 10-day retreat, January 7th, 1971. And that was the beginning of the
Wow.
rest of my life, because I did get the tools that I was looking for and continued to practice them. So in
Wow.
terms of how I came back as a teacher, I did stay a little longer than my allotted year, and then came back to the States, did what I needed to do to finish school, ended up with 2 years of independent study credit, went back to India to continue practicing and studying. And in
Wow.
1974, I was I had decided I was going to spend the rest of my life in India, and I had to come back for like a brief interlude, and do some things in the States. So I went to see one of my teachers, this woman whose name or nickname was Deepa Ma, Deepa's
Deep
mom.
Amaya.
She lived in Calcutta, to get her blessing for my very brief journey back to the United States before I went
Mm.
back to India forever. And she said to me, when you go back, you'll be teaching. And I said, no, I won't. And she said, yes, you will. And I said, no, I won't. I thought it was ludicrous,
Yeah.
just ridiculous. And
Yeah.
saying, no, I won't. And she kept saying, yes, you will. And, and then she said two things, which I think are real gifts. She said, you really understand suffering. That's why you should teach.
Mm.
And it was the first time I realized in a way that everything I'd been through in my earlier life could be of value in my service to others.
Mm.
Um, and the other thing she said was, you can do anything you want to do. It's your thinking you can't do it that's going to stop you. And
Yeah.
I left her room. It was up 4 flights of stairs in Calcutta. I walked down those stairs thinking, no, I won't. That's ridiculous. And came back to the States, and life
Mm.
unfolded. And one day I woke up and I thought, oh, she was right. Look at that. And that's how I became a teacher.
Oh my goodness. Oh, what a beautiful story. It seems like, there was like a direct transmission there from Deepama to you,
Yeah, yeah.
um, and to also to remind that inner self that you are a teacher, you can be a teacher, and you can bring this to many more people. There's two things that you've said that are really important, around this conversation of bias. And as you know, you've read the book, bias is a learned habit that I believe can be unlearned. Not I believe, science shows it can be unlearned. And the Dharma shows it can be unlearned using mindfulness and loving kindness and these tools, these skills that you were learning. So there's two aspects of it. This first thing that you said, the first noble truth that there's suffering in the world. And what I found in the book, um, real change or real happiness at work. What I shared there was the acceptance of suffering, like acceptance that there's violence, acceptance that there's bias, acceptance there's bigotry. And that's really hard for a lot of people to do, right? It's like we constantly should reality that there should be no sexism, there should be no racism, these things shouldn't be, but they are. Um, so how do you support people who are shooting reality? um, you know,
Well, sometimes I think it takes an exploration even of the words, because the word acceptance often implies to us that we should be pleased,
yes,
like I'm accepting it with some delight. Oh, good. There's this terrible thing going on. But it doesn't really mean that at all. It's sort of and self-knowledge or introspection, I think, is always useful. Like seeing our kind of futile protestation and our insistence that, we're only going to focus on that bad thing and not on people's efforts to change it, or our own not being defined by it, or sort of like trying to take in a bigger picture all at
yeah,
the same time, is just acknowledging this is going on and it can have these effects. And I am learning, or we are learning, or we are making these efforts to dismantle that, in an
yeah,
immediate sense or whatever. It's like acknowledging all of it, I think, is very important if we want to look at the word acceptance.
yeah. So it's almost like wise view, right? So really getting out of that narrow focus and seeing, well, oh, what are the causes and conditions of all these challenges? Um,
Mhm.
you know, and that was really what got me started in this work. I think it was 2012 when I first sat with you. I was an attorney, practicing as an attorney at the time, and I was like that rah-rah, like, no, it shouldn't be this way. And it was one of your Dharma talks. It was like, oh, let's kind of be curious with this, right? Um, and one of the things that often comes up for me around all things related to breaking bias or any sort of conflict across humans and human cultures, which is speech. And one of the things that's really inspired me about you is um, the use of wise speech, particularly not speaking when harm could be done, whether it's conscious or unconscious. Could you speak a little bit about the role of, speech, in kind of bringing people together and, yeah,
I guess the underlying and often unspoken, reality is also not speaking. It's
yeah,
listening.
it's
And
listening.
one of the really important lessons for me in practicing mindfulness is seeing my own assumptions. Maybe I make an assumption about somebody because I heard something about them, but it's not something I have picked up myself in an exchange. But that thing I heard about them is right there, and I've
Mm,
now rigidly categorized them as lazy or uninteresting or biased or whatever. But if I recognize that and I let go of it for now in this interest of discovery, of exploration, like let me actually listen and come to my own conclusions. It's not like you never have a feeling, or a response or a conclusion, but to hold rigidly that which we don't actually know for ourselves
yeah,
is harmful, so that's the kind of assumption. Or certainly there is the assumption of, born of bias, historically familiar in our families, in our cultures, whatever it is, that we are holding in some way. And if it's so, as you know, of course, better than most, it can be so unconscious, which means it's fast,
yeah,
and to be able to slow down our reaction, not just blurt something out, um, in order to see like what's cooking inside of me, like what's
yeah,
motivating me, can be very illuminating. And then we have a choice. Maybe we want to let it go for now, or maybe we see like, whoa, that's born of nothing,
yeah,
uh, or whatever it might be. And of course we all have many experiences of that. So it's the ability to not rush headlong into a reaction that gives us the opportunity to see where we're coming from. And and again, it doesn't mean we lose all kind of
mm,
discernment, or uh willingness to act in a certain way, but it doesn't have to be so habitual and
Yeah.
so driven in ways that we don't necessarily understand.
Yeah, I mean, Daniel Kahneman talks about this, in his book, shifting from system one thinking to system two thinking, right? That habitual thought pattern of reactivity, which is really just a habit, right? Because we've done it this way in the past, we continue to just build that muscle. And, meditation and mindfulness really gives us the opportunity to begin to see how the machine is turning, how contact with this person with, who wears glasses or has dark hair or has a certain gender is triggering these stories in my mind, which is then triggering a reaction. And I have a choice whether I want to follow that reaction. Um, and what I've noticed is oftentimes beneath the reaction, and when it's, habitual and is tainted by a distorted view, is fear or pain,
Hmm.
which is really the way I've been suffering around something that may have happened to me, which is now being projected onto
Hmm.
someone else. And this is where, what you've really offered the world with loving kindness really comes in. So yeah, I'd love for you to actually define what loving kindness is and how you came to this practice and the role of loving kindness in kind of breaking some of these reactivities.
Well, another thing that I've been fascinated by is not only the kind of assumptions we make toward those we have some, kind of bias or prejudice toward, clearly, once we look, but also the ways we can make assumptions about people just from sheer indifference.
Yes.
All the many beings we might
Mm,
encounter in our lives, maybe someone who plays a role in our life. So we see them now and then, like checkout person in the supermarket or somebody like that. And we, in effect, look through them rather than at them,
at them.
and so however we might respond is really born of that kind of objectification
Yes.
and indifference. And so loving kindness practice as a practice is something that uh, is almost like a direct antidote to that, as
Mm,
well as the kind of rigidly holding on to some idea about ourselves or
right.
about somebody else. So, loving kindness practice is a practice, it's a meditative approach that's like a big complement to mindfulness
Yeah.
practice. Just stylistically, they're distinct.
Hmm.
So, in loving kindness practice, we might silently repeat certain phrases, which are a way of paying attention differently.
Yeah.
So, with ourselves, for example, if we're in the habit of maybe at the end of the day evaluating ourselves and pretty much only remembering the mistakes we made and the
Right.
word we flubbed and the stupid thing we said at that meeting, so much so that our whole sense of who we are and all that will ever be just collapses around that comment. It's
Mm,
comment. Instead of only fixating on that, we might acknowledge that, but also we kind of expand and wish ourselves well. May I be safe. May I be happy. It's like gift giving or blessing.
yeah.
And so it's not like being conflict avoidant or trying to deny the problems, but we can get so like narrowed, so obsessed. And here we are. It's like, take a breath, breathe free. May I be safe. May I be happy. And then we see what happens. Or for all those many beings we look right through, what happens when we, in effect, look at them, call them to mind in meditation, and
Yeah.
may you be safe. May you be happy.
Yeah.
So what happens over time is that the kind of incredibly rigid sense of self and other and us and them, it just starts to dissolve.
Yeah.
And here we are, uh, and joined in a way. It doesn't mean you like everybody or you're going to invite them home or try to please them in some way. But there's that bone deep knowing that our lives do have something to do with one another.
It's I love that bones deep felt sense experience of interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh would call it. And I know that happened to me on my first retreat when I practiced loving kindness, because I was at a time I had suffered from a lot of depression and anxiety. I had attempted on my own life. And for me, it was a gift. I was like, oh my God, I'm alive. So I need to do whatever I need, whatever I can to like, address the suffering that I'm feeling. And
Mhm.
loving kindness was one of those things. And practicing these tools, as a scientist, I was like, well, how does this work? Why don't people talk about this? I mean, at that time, the science was just coming out around its relationship to bias. um, and basically what it's doing is really helping us build new neurotransmitters, new habits, because our brain is so wired for um, what's known as like the negativity bias, going towards that. What loving kindness does is tries to kind of provide that antidote of like, may you be safe, may I be safe, may I be happy, may I be healthy, with these positive affirmations. And then I don't know, through that process of cultivation of these positive sets of thoughts, emotions, ideas, um, the balance turns. So even when like difficult things arise, I feel like I have had more capacity to withstand them,
Mhm.
and I mean, that's what the evidence also shows, thankfully, thanks to so many scientists. Um, so thank you for that. And one of the things I've always wanted to ask you is, um, what is like, how would you describe the difference between loving kindness, empathy, and compassion? Because sometimes they all like kind of feel the same, and in our English language, they get kind of bottled up together. But particularly as you think about this as qualities of the heart mind, because they're all important, I would say, in this work of breaking bias.
Well, I would, probably go back to the Buddhist psychology, which would be my framework for
Hmm.
fine differentiation between mind
Great.
states. Um, Loving kindness is a sense of connection, and it's often born from a growing recognition that, in fact, everybody wants to be happy, not in a superficial sense, but in a deeper sense. We all want a sense of being at home somewhere
Yeah.
in this body, in this mind, with one another on this planet. We all want belonging, in other words. And it's because
Yeah.
of the force of ignorance, the distortions, the lies we've been told that we believe, and that where happiness is to be found, what's strong, what's weak, that's why we cause so much suffering, for ourselves and for others. But everybody underneath that really wants to be happy.
Yes.
And so the sense of connection is born out of that recognition. Uh, Compassion, which is like a very closely aligned quality, as one of my friends, this researcher Barbara Fredrickson, once said, compassion is like love that's looking at suffering.
Mm,
It's not so much based on the recognition that everybody wants to be happy. It's more based on a recognition that we're all so vulnerable. It's not like we all suffer to the same degree, because we don't, but
yeah.
life is so fragile. It's so changeable. Anybody's life can change on a dime. And so that's like the basis. Compassion itself is defined in the Buddhist psychology. It's kind of a two-part definition or description. It's the trembling or the quivering of the heart
Hmm.
in response to seeing pain or suffering.
Yeah.
And it's a movement of the heart. It's a movement toward, to see if we can be of help.
Yeah.
So that first part, the trembling or the quivering of the heart, is what we would call empathy. It's like
Yeah.
a resonance. It's a felt sense of like, ooh, that likely hurts, to be lied to
Yeah.
be abandoned, whatever it is, like, ooh, that
Yeah.
likely really hurts. The compassion part is the movement toward. Now,
Hmm.
notice it's not a movement into,
Into, yeah.
burn up yourself, because then you can't help anybody, right?
Yeah.
You're defined by that other suffering. And it's also not a movement toward, it's not a movement toward to seize control,
Yeah.
be like the savior, to fix everything. It's a
Yeah.
movement toward to see if you can be of help. So there's a lot implied there.
Yeah.
The research is also saying these days that you can make a distinction between empathy and compassion.
Mm,
You can make a distinction between empathy and compassion, because you might have that genuine moment of empathy, but you're frightened
Yeah.
by the immensity of the suffering. You just want to run away, or you're already exhausted
Exhausted. Yeah.
and you think, I can't move toward anything, like
Yeah.
going back to bed. It's too much.
Yeah.
Or, you might have that strange savior thing. Uh,
Hmm.
I'm going to move into and I'm going to make it all better because it's all about me, or some weird
Yeah.
thing, but to have compassion, which is definitely possible,
Yeah.
takes some real understanding of it as a movement toward to see if we can be of help.
What I love about that, I always think of compassion as like sympathy plus empathy plus action. Sympathy is of the mind. It understands that there's pain, and empathy again is that trembling of the heart, and then some action to respond. But what's really important about compassion is, um, the power of mindfulness here is seeing suffering from the lens of the person who's suffering and their needs versus kind of projecting onto them what we would want, right? Does that make sense at all? Or
It does. It's just so delicate, because one
yeah.
of the research studies I saw um, talked about people who over identify with the person
Mm,
suffering or the people who are suffering, because then what happens is a state of what they're calling empathic distress.
yes.
It's like too much.
Yes.
And from the world of activism, how often people burn out. And
Yeah.
it's not because they don't care. They care enormously and they are
Yeah.
looking at things no one else pretty much wants to look at.
Yeah.
But there's a tremendous amount of burnout.
Yeah. And then that's where a lot of the other destructive emotions come in: alienation, doubt, cynicism, and which can cause a lot of other, physical, mental, and emotional challenges for people. So I'm sure there are a lot of people listening and watching us right now who are deeply distressed by the state of our world. And, one invitation is, of course, let's begin to see the causes and conditions. Let's begin to expand the horizon. But, what are some ways loving kindness can be practiced, more day to day outside of meditation?
Well, the kind of classical phrases one uses in meditation are often adapted, for different situations.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be sitting formally in meditation. You could be reflecting on the world and the, players in the world, the parties involved, or you could be on a Zoom meeting and looking at all the little faces and boxes,
Yeah.
and having the phrase and just gently repeating it to see what happens within your body, within your mind. That seems appropriate to you. I have friends who are using phrases, contemplating certain beings, may you be free of hatred. May you come out of this um, state, that seems to be entrapping you.
Mhm.
Uh, may all beings be safe, and something that is expressing that kind of energy and really seeing the effect on yourself.
Yeah, that's right. Because it's really about shifting the energetics um, internally before we can respond externally. Um, that's really true. One of the things that I wanted to also ask you is, I'm someone who's of South Asian descent who, was born into these traditions in a way, um, except my family immigrated here and they were, trained in the Western Academy and kind of thought of all, they've changed quite a bit in the last 40 years. But at least when I was younger, my parents, who are physicians, and they thought a lot of this was superstition, right? What you were learning in India and brought to the West, because that's the training they had in their medical schools in India. And for me, it's been a gift to kind of return to my own like root traditions with your assistants and other Western teachers, because my mind also was colonized in a way, right? Where I needed to listen to a Western teacher who I trusted more than I would a South Asian teacher. And the last couple of years, I've noticed that there's a lot of backlash around
Mhm.
cultural appropriation, and which for me is such muddy waters, right, around ownership of the truth. Um, how do you make sense of it?
Well, honestly, I'll be extremely frank,
Please
I
do.
don't feel particularly culpable,
Yes.
feel like I've stolen, artifacts for the British Museum or something like that. Because my own teachers, I have never had a Western teacher. All my teachers were Asian. They were either Burmese or Indian, or Tibetan.
Mhm.
Um, and it was their gift, they wanted nothing more than to see their students take uh, these teachings, especially these methods, um, and be able to transmit them. Deepa Ma told me to teach. All of my teachers were
Yeah,
encouraging. They thought that was their responsibility, and it's
right.
what they wanted to see happen. So there was not this sense of I own this.
Yes.
And in fact, they were all very kind of broad-minded in a way. Like my first teacher was 𝐕𝐢𝐝𝐻. And the first night of my first retreat, he said, the Buddha did not teach Buddhism. The Buddha taught a way of life. This is
Yes.
available for anybody.
Mhm.
And then my friend, my colleague, Jack Cornfield, he was kind of having a parallel life in Thailand, while Joseph Goldstein and I were in India. And his teacher was named Ajahn Chah. And when Jack was about to come back from Thailand to the States and he was going to teach, he said to Ajahn Chah, I don't know, how it's going to be, because most of the people I will probably be teaching were not born as Buddhists, and they're going to, maybe feel this is sort of weird. And Ajahn Chah looked at him and said, call it Christianity,
Yes.
you know, which was like, okay. So they felt it was their gift. They very much wanted us um, to be able to do what we did, and we didn't come back, with a kind of world conquering ethos.
Yeah.
It was just
Yes.
like, somebody asked us to teach, and we said okay, and then somebody else asked us to teach, and we said okay, and
Mhm.
I never in a million years imagined that what has happened would happen. That there
Yeah.
would be science, there would be research, there would be exploration of mindfulness, and so many different venues and so many different avenues, and
Mm.
that things would just explode. It wasn't like we set out to do that, it
Yeah.
just happened.
Yeah. And it's alleviated so much suffering for so many human beings, so many beings, across the board.
Hmm.
And it's become a mechanism for us to really understand ourselves and one another. And that's such a beautiful reflection, Sharon, because that's kind of when I think about it from like a bull's eye view, because I grew up like my root tradition is actually in Kriya Yoga with Paramahansa Yogananda. So he was an Indian teacher who came to the West in 1920 with that same message because um, you know I don't know why, but he needed to bring these teachings to the West so we can foster understanding across difference. So I really sometimes like when I meditate and I think of you and Joseph and Jack and Tara and all these other wonderful teachers from the West, you're basically those bridge builders, right? Who like understand the ways of the East, but also of the West as well. And how can we accommodate, these teachings, which are really about overcoming what you said, defilements, the delusion of our separation
Hmm.
within our heart and mind. And yeah, that's kind of what's inspired me around the work for breaking bias too, because it's
Yeah.
really in that same lineage. Um,
Well, all that being said, what I said about cultural appropriation, I do think obviously there's a great tendency in the West to appropriate things, and
yeah,
I remember I was teaching loving kindness somewhere for a weekend, and somebody came up to me and she said, "This is so incredible. When did you make it up?" And I said, "You're really lucky. I didn't make up any." And so I think it is incumbent upon, all of us to really honor the fact there is a lineage, and there's history, and there's a tradition, and that we are always, every single person is reinterpreting that tradition in our own practice and with our own experience and our own expression. And yet there's a body of knowledge, that we're trying to do honor to.
Yeah. And it's such a beautiful reflection, that particular reflection that you shared, because that's rooted in this delusion, or what I would call an information gap, that's so pervasive in the West, and it's deeply unconscious. And that, that's our training and bias, through our education, through our media, through even our families and, close relatives, which is this entitlement that people in the West are better than everyone else, and everyone else outside of the West is primitive or savage and had no civilization whatsoever. And it's kind of like a foundational unspoken falsity upon which things build up, right?
Mhm.
And for you, you're just like, oh, that doesn't exist. I'm part of a tradition that's 2,500 years old and happens to come from South Asia, right? And Tibet and Thailand and other places. And it's continuing today. So, like, that's where I feel like the correction is so important
Mhm.
for us to really see one another as, you know, fellow beings versus, beings that are ranked because of our identities and backgrounds.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's also incumbent upon scientists, and researchers to remember that, not feel like, oh, we've invented this great thing.
Yeah. You know, I'd love for you to walk us through a practice, but one question that comes up for me is, this is more from a spiritual sense. Um, I've been really contemplating, and this is one of the imponderables in Buddhism, karma, because if you contemplate on karma, you'll go crazy. And sometimes I have, and I'm like, oh, this is a thought experiment for going crazy, because their just causes and conditions are so vast, infinite. But sometimes I also like feel a sense of, I would say, not a sense of despair, but sense of suspicion around how these tools, these ancient tools, are being commercialized in our world. Um, and its relationship to karma, right? Because every cause has an effect, and like the intentionality with which we do this work is so important. Um, so yeah, I'd love to just hear your thoughts on, like, for particular people that are, we kind of throw this word around karma in our everyday vernacular, but how would you describe it from a Buddhist psychology perspective um, around this work? Yeah.
The imponderable. Well, one of the things they say is that you should never talk about karma in reference to someone else, like, oh, that's just your karma. That's
Mm,
why you've lost your home, or, never, because causes and conditions are very complex. And that's like equivalent to victim blaming.
yeah.
The only kind of appropriate use for karma, and it's, as you said, you can't think about it endlessly because you'll go crazy. But it said, it's just too much. Um, is to is to really investigate whether, um, let's say, your habits are playing a role in what is ensuing in your life. So they use the example of somebody who's like very miserly, feels they can't be generous. Um, they in effect are impoverished, even if they have piles of money. Maybe they don't have many friends. They feel really lonely. They're always jealous of how much other people have. And, so sort of like the milieu, the environment in which they are living is also produced by that mind state they have
Yeah.
cultivated. Don't share anything. And so it's things like that. I know it's complex these days because we look at intention and impact and so
Yeah,
on. But looking for the intention or the motivation behind your actions, I think is still illuminating.
I agree.
To understand sort of what happened, and how it left you feeling.
Yeah,
Uh, so it's basically karma means actions and consequences. And by
mm,
action, they don't necessarily mean handing somebody that dollar bill. They mean the intentionality that motivated you to hand them the dollar bill.
yeah,
Because you might give someone a dollar bill that someone, street person's asking you for money out of complete disdain,
yeah,
or you might do it out of that sense of shared humanity,
yeah,
wishing somebody well, and that is said to make a difference.
yeah. No, thank you so much. That's really important around this work too, like the intentionality. And for me, intentionality is really around alleviating suffering, particularly the pain we cause ourselves, lost in theories and stories and dramas about our past and our futures, and forgetting the joy of the present moment. But then also kind of bridging those information gaps, a lot of the misconceptions that are actually false, but they're kind of dictating our lives, because of just how history has transpired in the last couple of centuries. Um, but it's been such a joy to talk to you, Sharon. I'd love to invite you to share a practice if possible. Um,
I would love to. I have so many questions for you. We'll have to find another venue.
yes, indeed, we will.
That's great. Okay, so I would suggest if you like, you can just sit comfortably, close your eyes or not. Let your energy settle into your body and just repeat whatever phrases make most sense to you. Silently repeat in terms of the blessing, the gift you would like to give to yourself.
Mm,
May I be safe, be happy, be peaceful, whatever it might be. Just gently repeating the phrases over and over again. You don't have to force this kind of feeling or manufacture anything. And bring to mind somebody who's helped you. Maybe you've never even met them, but they've inspired you from afar. You can get an image of them or say their name to yourself. Somebody who kind of brings a smile to you. And offer phrases of loving kindness to them. May you be safe, be happy, be peaceful. And someone you know who's struggling right now, bring them here and offer phrases of loving kindness to them. May you be safe, be happy, be peaceful. And then all beings everywhere, all people, all
mm,
creatures, all those in existence, near and far, known and unknown. May all beings be safe, be happy, be peaceful. And when you feel ready, you can open your eyes or lift your gaze, and we'll end the practice.
Thank you so much, Sharon.
Thank you.
So beautiful and centering, and yeah, I feel connected to myself and all beings everywhere. You know, and with you, you were the person I thought of. My
You.
dear teacher.
Thank you.
So yeah, I can't wait to continue this conversation in so many ways, and I hope you feel the imprint of your work in this work of breaking bias too, because it's a big part of it. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Well, I'm deeply honored by that.
Well, we'll talk to you soon. Bye, Sharon.